In his memoir, My Losing Season, Pat Conroy tells the story of his senior year as point guard on the Citadel's basketball team and what he learned from losing. He also describes in this memoir the people who reduced his life to pieces. Conroy's father, he writes, was a master at demeaning, attacking, and undermining. He did it verbally, emotionally. Conroy says, there was nothing my father could not teach me about the architecture of despair. I knew all its shapes and blueprints, about its columns and archways. My father could send me reeling down its hallways, screaming into its attics with the curl of his thin-lipped mouth. His put-downs baffled me, shamed me, and I promised myself I would never be like him. Conroy's life was marked by the persistent and severe ways in which his father tore him apart, and ways in which he returned, his father did, to irritate the most severe wounds so that they never healed either. My father possessed a genius for scab flicking, for zeroing in on that tenderest spot of the psyche where the healing was most difficult, exposing the rawness of the wound again and again over the years. Conroy's psyche was further tested by his coach Mel Thompson. His harsh words and attitude beat down Conroy and his teammates. He's still haunted by particular phrases. You're just mediocre, you might as well not shoot. He and his teammates, he says, struggled against a coach who reduced them to nothing. My teammates had found themselves in a state that was birthplace and briar patch to me, a despair with no windows or exits, a futility that made hope vain and future unthinkable. Come to me, all you who labor and are overburdened, and I will give you rest. But what is this labor that Jesus talks about? It's not simply the labor of the basketball court or the home or the office downtown, although certainly on occasion we need a little rest from that. It's not work per se. Hard work is always central to a productive, contributing life, and Jesus worked hard, and so have all who've contributed anything to our world. Those who do not give themselves to daily labor end up soft and shallow and self-indulgent. So then, what kind of labor does he want to lift from us? What kind of burden does he want to free us from? I think it is the drive to prove ourselves over and over again against the failures and condemnations of the past in order to reestablish our worth. It is doing in order to be worthy of life, to be acceptable, to be lovable. I must measure up, I must perform, please prove myself acceptable with every new day. Continually, I must justify my existence on the planet. That's the heavy burden that Jesus is talking about, of which Conroy is an extreme example. You see, every Jew listening to Jesus would have known precisely what he meant by the word yoke. The yoke was the law, that massive body of statutes and commandments found in the book of Moses, which every good Jew was bound to worry about and struggle with, lest he fall out of favor with God and community. His very existence, his happiness, his well-being depended upon his performance of these high and heavy demands day in, day out. But where do we find anybody burdened by that struggle to keep that law in our time? Most of us don't even know the Big Ten, let alone give our whole energy to the exacting performance of the 613 central commands of that early God. Oh, in a corner here or there, this old passion and compulsion remains, and we smile when we run into it in one kind of orthodoxy or another. But where do we run into that kind of compulsion and drive to please in our culture today? Well, I think it's around. If you look, it's out there in full force. The rules have changed, as have the faces that we hope to please, but the compulsion is just as strong as ever, just as wearing and deadly a burden. I'm convinced that we in our time have secularized the legalism that Jesus came to liberate us from. No longer is it fear of God, or at least I don't smell much of that out there. Rather, it is more often fear of the culture, the crowd, the colleague, the community, and the rules are just as elaborate and intricate as Torah and Talmud, if unwritten and subtly pressed upon us. Rules about how thin we ought to be, what circles we ought to run in, how much power we ought to assert, what perks we ought to display, what community we ought to live in, what values we ought to tolerate, on and on and on. Arthur Brisbane, newspaper editor, used to tell his best cartoonist, Winsor McKay, that he was the second best cartoonist in the world. One day an associate asked Arthur who was the first. The editor replied, "I don't know, but it sure keeps McKay on his toes." So life for many, in quiet and subtle ways even, salvation, happiness, depends upon measuring up, being one of them, winning acceptance, gaining approval. I think it starts out very early. It seems we all start out in life, do we not? Small, inferior, clumsy, worrying soon about our place in life, and our parents are very often helpful in that regard. There's no point in blaming them if they undermine our self-respect, even in small ways compared to Conroy's father. It's because their parents did it to them and their parents before them. His father must have had terrible doubts about himself to inflict all that on his son. And then it becomes more of a problem for adolescents in a different way. Their exclusion is experienced as the ultimate death and damnation. Many teenagers will sell their soul, do whatever is necessary, ingest whatever is necessary, wear whatever is necessary or not wear whatever is necessary, mouth whatever is necessary to win approval, acceptance, salvation. But I'm not sure but what these are not simply a reflection of the adult society around them, where it is more subtle but equally powerful. This religious compulsion, I call it religious because it seems to achieve a level of ultimate concern and passion in the lives of many. In and of themselves, many of these can be innocuous, but they seem to worry so much about how they look, or what they wear, or who they're seen with, or how they're getting on. There is such drive behind the passion for success and status on the part of so many, such frenzy to make it, to achieve the symbols which make you acceptable. I don't condemn, I'm just saddened by a scenario in which so many seem to be working so hard at life, seem so unable to be comfortable in their own skin, as they are and where they are, seem so impelled to prove themselves over and over again. Saddened because it doesn't work. It does not produce what we want, ever. The unconditional affirmation of the world and people around us. It never does. Someone has said that expecting the world to treat you fairly, to reward you, to honor you, to affirm you because you're a good person, a successful person, is like expecting the bull not to charge you because you are a vegetarian. So what is the answer? According to this old faith, it is openness to an alien, strange, different word than the words of parents or peers or public. You who are so weary and heavy laden, beneath the yoke of all the demands that you labor to satisfy, says Jesus, come to me and I will give you rest. And what is this soul rest? It is rest in that strange love that affirms us just as we are, no matter how the day is gone, no matter how anybody else feels about us, no matter the achievements or failures of life. It's the deep, deep-seated recognition that we don't have to prove ourselves and we don't have to prove a thing to anybody. We have a right to be who we are and where we are, with all our strengths and weaknesses and successes and failures and profile and peculiarities. we are acceptable. We need seek only to be faithful as the opportunity arises and useful, and everything else is quite secondary, to be played lightheartedly as a game. It is rest in the grace of God that we see in this Jesus. Salvation is the grace that comes in him, liberating us from the failures and condemnations and judgments of the past, so that we may live forward with free spirits this day. Lewis Smedes died this past year, too young, after a life of inspiration to many of us. I think if he'd written nothing else but his description of the grace that is rest for our souls, his life would have been fulfilled. Let me return to it again. Grace does not make everything right in our world. Grace's trick is to show us that it is right for us to live, that it is truly good, wonderful even, for us to be breathing and feeling, at the same time that everything clustering around us may be quite wretched. Grace is not a ticket to Fantasy Island. Fantasy Island is dreamy fiction. Grace is not a potion to charm life to our liking. Charms are magic. Grace does not cure all our cancers, transform all our kids into winners, or send us all soaring into the high skies of sex and success. Grace is rather an amazing power to look earthly reality full in the face, see its sad and tragic edges, and yet feel in our deepest being that it is good and right for us to be alive on God's good earth. Grace is power to see life very clearly, admit that it's sometimes all wrong, and still know that somehow in the center of your life, it's all right. This is one reason we call it amazing grace. Grace is the one word for all that God is for us in the form of Jesus. And that's rest, is it not? Rest from the struggle to be somebody, to prove to father long ago, or mother present, or colleagues, or friends, or crowd that you are somebody. Rest in the reality that no matter what else you are or are not, you are nothing less than a son, a daughter of a loving God. Conray finally found that rest in a friend who became his grace, an English professor who befriended him and encouraged him to try writing. But it wasn't the gift of language that brightened the eaves of Conway's brain. It was also the gift of this man's friendship, Professor Dole. At a pivotal point, this professor told him, "You are too hard on yourself. For reasons I don't understand, you are deeply unhappy and it pains me. I think you could be special if you only thought there was anything special about you. Someone has taught you to hate yourself." I hope I haven't crossed some line, Mr. Conroy. I value our friendship too much. And with those words and that friendship, Conroy was able to begin putting the pieces of his life back together again. L. Gregory Jones, Dean of Duke University Divinity School, comments on the story and memoir. All of us emerge in pieces out of complex factors that include our own sinfulness as well as the sins that we suffer from others, haunting words, tattered emotions. We search for friends of our mind, people who mediate God's grace in Jesus in ways that gives us back the pieces of our lives in the right order. But then as we reflect upon those people who have been the friends of our minds, and we all have them, as we give thanks for the healing balm of the friendship that they've offered us over the years, the question rebounds on us, does it not? To whom are we called to be holy friends? Who needs us to give them back the pieces of their lives in the right order? And I ask, might this not be the light yoke and the easy burden that Jesus offers, calls upon us to bear? Jane Brownson, Dean of Western Theological Seminary up in God's country, Holland, Michigan, tells how he learned from his father, a minister. My father and mother would take us boys with him, I think there were 3 boys, on Sunday afternoons to call on the shut-ins of the church, and we would sing for them. This duty, I must confess, was among the most onerous I remember being imposed upon me. We boys hated those Sunday afternoon trips, cooped up in the car, dragged into strange-smelling nursing homes, fussed over by old ladies. We would stand idly by while my parents made small talk and then on cue would dutifully sing. This singing was actually the highlight of the visit because it usually elicited a warm response from our listeners, but most of all because it signaled that our departure was imminent. There was this one woman in particular whom we visited with considerable regularity and with even less than the usual dim enthusiasm. I do not remember her name. She was very old, barely able to speak, and seemed completely immobilized. My father would put his ear almost next to her mouth and struggle to make out her words. You see, we could not interact with this woman, and she could show no signs of appreciation for our efforts. I remember feeling as if I was singing to a wall. I didn't know if she could hear or understand what we were doing. But in the very last week of our time in that town, at the ripe old age of 9 years, I would come to realize how mistaken I had been about our visits to this woman and would begin to gain insight into the strange way in which our sorrows and our salvation become interwoven. This was, my father had told her, our last visit. My father had accepted a call to serve as professor up in Michigan, and so we were saying goodbye. But of course, we would sing for her before we left, and her favorite hymn was always the same, ironically, the hymn that was also the favorite of my kid brother Billy in our evening family times around the piano. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the near waters roll, while the tempest still is high. Hide me, O my Savior, hide, till the storm of life is past, safe into the haven guide, O receive my soul at last. And as we sang those words, to my amazement, I saw streams of tears flow down her cheeks, and I watched her frail body shake as she sobbed without making a sound. And in that moment, something was suddenly made clear to that 9-year-old, something deep and important. Those bothersome Sunday afternoon duties meant much more than I had ever imagined. At that moment, I began to glimpse a reality that would confront me with greater depth and power as I matured. The subterranean river of our lives, flowing far below the polite niceties of normal conversation, beneath the casual and routine order of our lives, between and among us, the river of love that slowly, ever so slowly, nurtures this broken world back to life. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What a marvelous picture of a burden that turned out light for a young man, because a burden shared with others, shared above all with the one who is gentle and humble of heart, in order that someone with so little to give to this world might know that she too is deeply loved. And that's rest for all of us, I think, knowing that wherever we are in life, and whatever it may bring, of stumble and sadness, of glory and gladness, we are all loved, all the way to the end and beyond.